All right, you glorious bastards. Welcome back for another deep dive. You know how we do it? We take a mountain of boring crap and chisel out the good stuff. The stuff that'll make you sound like the smartest asshole at the bar. And today, we're tackling climate change.
Not just climate change, the history of climate change negotiations. We're talking decades of global summits, political pissing contests, and enough hot air to melt a glacier.
Exactly. It's like watching a bunch of overpaid bureaucrats try to herd cats. Only the cats are countries and the stakes are, the future of the goddamn planet. And speaking of cats herding, COP29 is rolling into Baku, Azerbaijan. I'm already picturing oil barons sipping champagne while the world burns.
Yeah, the choice of Azerbaijan as host is
Yeah.
controversial, to say the least. But to understand why everyone's so pissed, we need to go back, way back. Buckle up, kids. We're going on a time-traveling guilt trip.
Okay, let's cut the crap and get this show on the road. Hit us with the history lesson. What the hell's a COP anyway?
COP stands for Conference of the Parties. Basically, all the countries that signed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC.
UNF what the fuck ever. Just tell us what it is without all the fancy acronyms.
Think of it as the rule book for global climate action. It's a treaty where countries basically agreed, yeah, climate change is a real bitch and we should probably do something about it.
So the UNFCCC is like the rule book, and the COP is the annual meeting where they try to figure out how to actually follow those rules.
Exactly. Except these meetings are less about following rules and more about arguing, posturing, and making promises they might not keep. It's like a high-stakes poker game with the fate of humanity as the pata.
Sounds like my kind of party. So when did this whole COP circus begin?
1995, Berlin. COP1, the first of its kind. World leaders, scientists, activists all gather to discuss this newfangled thing called climate change. Back then, it was still a bit of a fringe issue.
1995. Damn, those dinosaurs were ahead of their time.
Yeah.
Did they, solve climate change right then and there?
If only it were that easy. They did agree that countries should start figuring out how to reduce their emissions, which was a start, I guess.
A start. Sounds like they were just stalling for time.
Maybe. But remember, this was before climate change was making headlines every day. It took time for the world to grasp the full scale of the shitstorm brewing.
Okay, so COP1, baby steps. What happened next in this climate change saga?
Fast forward to 1997, Kyoto, Japan. This is where they cooked up the famous Kyoto Protocol, the first legally binding agreement to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Legally binding. Those words send shivers down my spine. So did this Kyoto thing actually make a difference?
It had the potential to. The goal was for developed countries to cut their emissions by an average of 5% below 1990 levels by 2012. But there were some major roadblocks.
Roadblocks, let me guess. Those hats in Congress.
Well, the U.S. did refuse to ratify it, which didn't help. But there were other issues, too, like disagreements over how to account for carbon sinks, things like forests that absorb carbon dioxide.
So even back then they were arguing about the fine print. What a bunch of clowns.
It wasn't just about the trees, though. The debate over carbon sinks became a proxy for a bigger fight between developed and developing countries. Developed countries with their history of industrial pollution were being asked to make bigger cuts, while developing countries argued they needed room to grow their economies.
So basically everyone was pointing fingers and trying to pass the buck. Classic. What happened next in this climate clusterfuck?
COP6, The Hague 2000. Picture this: negotiators are locked in heated debates, tensions are running high, and then bam, the whole thing implodes. Negotiations collapse, the U.S. walked out, and the world was left wondering if these COPs were just a giant waste of time and money.
Wait, the U.S. just walked out. Talk about a dick move. What were they thinking?
The U.S. wasn't happy with the restrictions being placed on them, especially when it came to carbon sinks. They argued that their vast forests should give them more leeway. While European countries insisted on actual emissions cuts, it was a clash of ideologies and political maneuvering.
So COP6 was a total shit show. Did they ever manage to salvage anything from that wreckage?
They tried. They resumed the conference in Bonn in 2001, but the damage was done. The U.S. remained unmoved, and the Kyoto Protocol was left hanging by a thread. It was a stark reminder of how fragile these international agreements can be.
So basically a bunch of grown-ass adults threw a tantrum and screwed over the planet. Fantastic.
Yeah.
But didn't Russia have something to do with this Kyoto Protocol thingy?
Oh, yeah. Russia played a key role. The Kyoto Protocol needed to be ratified by enough countries representing a certain percentage of global emissions to actually go into effect.
Right, there were rules. So where did Russia fit into all this?
With the U.S. out of the picture, Russia held the deciding vote. They were hesitant to ratify at first, playing hardball to get concessions and financial aid. But in 2004, they finally came on board, and the Kyoto Protocol officially went into effect in 2005.
So Russia swooped in and saved the day. I guess even villains have their moments.
It was more about self-interest than heroism. But yeah, without Russia, the Kyoto Protocol would have been dead in the water.
Okay, so we had baby steps in Berlin, a near-death experience in The Hague, and a Russian rescue mission. This is already more drama than a Real Housewives reunion. But tell me, was the world actually getting any better at this whole climate thing?
That's the million-dollar question. Around this time, there was a growing realization that focusing solely on emissions reductions wasn't enough. Developing countries, often hit hardest by climate change, needed help adapting to the mess that was already unfolding.
So a shift in focus, like
Totally.
throwing a life preserver to someone who's already drowning.
Pretty much. At COP7 in Marrakech 2001, they established the Adaptation Fund to help developing countries finance projects to deal with things like sea level rise and extreme weather.
Adaptation fund. Sounds like a fancy way of saying, here's some cash to clean up the shit we made.
It was a recognition that climate change wasn't just a future threat. It was already a reality for millions of people.
Okay, I get it. You can't just expect poor countries to deal with the consequences of rich countries' actions without some help. But what about those big emissions cuts? Was anyone actually stepping up?
Well, progress was about as slow as a snail in a tar pit. Everyone was talking a big game, but when it came to actually slashing emissions, it was all talk and no action. It was like watching a bunch of toddlers arguing over who gets the biggest slice of cake while the house is burning down around them.
Sounds about right for those clowns. So what happened next in this slow-motion train wreck?
COP15, Copenhagen, 2009. This was supposed to be the big one. The moment they finally got their shit together and hammered out a new global agreement to replace the aging Kyoto Protocol. Expectations were sky high. But let's just say reality had other plans.
Oh, I smell a dumpster fire brewing. What went wrong in Copenhagen?
Everything. The negotiations were a tangled mess of competing interests, political grandstanding, and a whole lot of finger-pointing. Developed countries were still dragging their feet on emissions cuts and financial aid, while developing countries were demanding more support.
So basically a giant clusterfuck of epic proportions.
Yeah.
Color me surprised.
It was a major letdown. The final agreement, the so-called Copenhagen Accord, was so weak and non-binding, it was practically useless. It was like putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound.
A Band-Aid on a gaping wound. That's a beautiful way to put it. So Copenhagen was a bust. Did they ever recover from that disaster?
It took a while, but there was a glimmer of hope on the horizon. COP21 Paris 2015. This is where they finally birthed the Paris Agreement, the agreement everyone's been worshiping ever since.
Ah, the Paris Agreement. The holy grail of climate action.
Huh.
Tell us more about this magical agreement. Did it actually live up to the hype?
It was definitely a step in the right direction. For the first time, almost every country in the world agreed to work together to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, preferably 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. It was a landmark achievement, a moment of global unity in the face of a common threat.
Okay, so everyone agreed on a goal. That's something, right? But did they actually figure out how to get there?
That's where things get a little murky. Instead of setting strict emissions targets like the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement relies on countries submitting their own pledges, called Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs.
NDCs? Sounds like a bunch of bureaucratic bullshit to me.
Essentially, each country gets to decide how much they want to reduce their emissions based on their own circumstances. It's a more flexible approach, but it also relies heavily on trust and good faith.
Trust and good faith. From politicians. You're killing me. So did this whole NDC thing actually work? Were countries stepping up and making ambitious pledges?
Some did, some didn't. It was a mixed bag. The Paris Agreement definitely injected a much-needed dose of optimism into the climate talks. But it also came with a whole new set of challenges.
Challenges. Let me guess. More bickering, more broken promises, more kicking the can down the road.
You're catching on. The real work began after Paris, translating those pledges into concrete action and holding countries accountable for meeting their targets. And that's where things get really complicated.
Complicated? You mean like trying to herd a bunch of drunken monkeys?
Something like that. Remember, the Paris Agreement is based on cooperation, not coercion. There's no global climate police to enforce these pledges. It all comes down to peer pressure and international reputation.
Peer pressure. Are we back in high school now?
It might sound silly, but it plays a role. No country wants to be seen as the bad guy, the one holding back progress, but it's not always enough to get everyone on board.
Okay, so peer pressure and some vague sense of global responsibility. What could possibly go wrong?
Well, for starters, there's the issue of money. Remember those billions of dollars developed countries promised to help developing countries with their climate efforts?
Yeah, the adaptation fund or whatever they called it. Did those rich bastards actually cough up the cash?
Not all of it. And that's been a major point of contention ever since. There are constant debates about how much money is needed, who should contribute, and how it should be spent.
Shocker. Rich countries promising to help and then conveniently forgetting about their pledges. It's a tale as old as time.
The issue of finance is a constant source of tension in these negotiations. Developed countries argue that they're already doing their part, while developing countries point to the historical injustices and the disproportionate impacts of climate change. It's a complicated and often frustrating issue.
Complicated. Sounds more like a goddamn shit show to me. But hey, at least they're talking about it, right?
That's true. Dialogue is important, but it needs to translate into action. And that's what everyone was hoping for at COP26 in Glasgow in 2021.
Glasgow, the land of whiskey and bagpipes. Did they manage to get anything done amidst all the revelry?
Well, there was one particularly memorable moment, the whole phase down coal debacle.
Phase down coal. Sounds like a bunch of weasel words to me.
It was. There was a big push to phase out coal entirely, which makes sense considering it's the dirtiest fossil fuel out there. But in the final hours of the negotiations, India and China, both heavily reliant on coal, threw a hissy fit and insisted on changing the language to phase down coal instead.
India and China, huh? Those guys love their coal. So was this phase down thing a win or a loss for the climate?
It was a compromise, which means no one was truly happy. It highlighted the ongoing tensions between developed and developing countries and the difficulty of reaching a consensus on how to tackle the climate crisis.
Compromise the art of making everyone equally pissed off.
Yeah.
But hey, at least they agreed on something.
They did make some progress on other fronts, like reaffirming their commitment to that $100 billion per year in climate finance and setting new targets for reducing deforestation.
Okay, so Glasgow was a mixed bag. Some steps forward, some steps back. What about the next COP27? Where is that shit show held?
That one was in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt in 2022. And this one was significant because it finally delivered something developing countries had been demanding for decades: a loss and damage fund.
Loss and damage. Sounds expensive.
It is. It's the idea that wealthy, industrialized countries who are historically responsible for the majority of greenhouse gas emissions should pay up to help vulnerable developing countries cope with the impacts of climate change that they're already experiencing.
So basically making the polluters pay for the mess they made. I can get behind that.
It was a huge victory for developing countries, a recognition of the need for climate justice. But the details of how this fund will work, who will contribute, and how the money will be distributed are still being ironed out.
Of course, the devil's in the details. But hey, at least they finally acknowledged that rich countries have a responsibility to help out, right?
It was a major breakthrough. It showed that these COPs can actually deliver tangible results, even if it takes years or even decades of fighting to get there.
Okay, so COP27 was a win for the little guys. What about COP28? Didn't that just wrap up in Dubai?
That's right. COP28 in Dubai was all about the global stocktake, which is basically a progress report on how countries are doing in meeting their commitments under the Paris Agreement.
Report card time. So are we passing with flying colors or failing miserably?
Let's just say there's room for improvement. The stocktake revealed that while some countries have made some progress, overall emissions are still rising, and we're not on track to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement.
So we're basically screwed. Fantastic.
Not necessarily. There's still time to turn things around, but it's going to require a monumental effort from everyone. And that brings us to COP29, the main event, the reason we're all gathered here today, Baku, Azerbaijan.
Baku, baby. The land of oil barons and caviar dreams. What can we expect from this little shindig?
Well, for starters, a whole lot of controversy. The choice of Azerbaijan as host has been met with a chorus of criticism, and for good reason. The choice of Azerbaijan as host has been met with a chorus of criticism, and for good reason.
Controversy. In the world of climate politics, I'm shocked. To tell you, shocked.
Azerbaijan has a less than stellar human rights record, and it's heavily dependent on oil and gas production. Critics argue that it's not an appropriate venue for a climate conference, and they're worried that the Azerbaijani government might use the COP to greenwash its image.
Greenwash? You mean like trying to make themselves look all eco-friendly while they're raking in billions from fossil fuels?
Exactly. It's a classic case of hypocrisy, and it's not sitting well with a lot of people.
I can imagine. It's like inviting a serial killer to speak at a self-help seminar on anger management.
The optics aren't great, and with the world already struggling to wean itself off fossil fuels, having a major oil producer as the host of a climate conference sends a mixed message, to say the least.
Yeah, it's like inviting a fox to guard the henhouse.
So what's on the agenda for Baku, besides all the controversy and hypocrisy? What are the big issues they'll be grappling with?
One of the key focuses will be on implementing those NDCs we talked about earlier. Countries are expected to come to Baku with updated and more ambitious pledges to cut their emissions.
So it's like a climate pledge checkup. Are they actually going to hold those countries accountable for meeting their targets?
That's the million-dollar question. The Paris Agreement is based on trust and cooperation, but there's no real enforcement mechanism. It all comes down to peer pressure and international reputation.
Peer pressure and reputation. Sounds like a recipe for disaster to me. It's not ideal, but it's the system we have. And there's always the hope that countries will step up and do the right thing, even if it means sacrificing short-term economic gain for the long-term well-being of the planet.
Hope in this shit show. You're a braver soul than I am.
Hope is all we've got, my friend. Without it, we're truly screwed.
Well, that's a cheery thought. But you know what's not a cheery thought? That we have to wait a whole nother year to see how this dumpster fire unfolds. But hey, maybe that's a good thing. Gives us all time to stock up on booze and therapy.
I think we're all gonna need it.
Damn straight. But in all seriousness, folks, this climate shit is real. It's happening whether we like it or not. And we can't just sit back and wait for those suits in Baku to fix it. We all have to do our part.
Absolutely. Every action counts, whether it's reducing your own carbon footprint, supporting sustainable businesses, or holding our leaders accountable.
So go out there, raise hell, and make some noise, because the future of the planet depends on it. And that's a wrap for today, folks. Thanks for tuning into The Deep Dive. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into some other mind-blowing topic. Until then, stay curious, stay rebellious, and keep those middle fingers raised high. Peace out.